afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Change Board webinar, The Evolution of Leadership, How to Become a Better Leader for the New Millennium. My name is Mary Appleton, and I am Change Board's editor. We are delighted to be joined here today by Adam Kingl, Executive Director of Thought Leadership at London Business School. He's going to be talking about leadership in the 21st century, the role of learning in the workplace, and why embracing failure can often lead to a positive outcome. I feel like it's very timely for us to be having this webinar, particularly given the events of the past week. But before we begin, I'd like to run through a few guidelines. Throughout the webinar, if you'd like to pose a question or a comment to Adam, please enter this in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen and click Send. We'll be taking questions after the presentation, but please do feel free to pose a question at any time, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. There'll be also a couple of polls throughout the presentation, which will flash up on your screen, so we'd love you to contribute, and we'll allow about 20 seconds for the poll. Also, we'll be running a live Twitter feed throughout the webinar, so please do be sure to tweet and credit your tweets with the hashtag CBLeadership. That's hashtag CBLeadership. Please do also direct your comments to @ChangeBoard. We'll be recording the webinar, so we'll send you a full link to the recording in the next few days. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Adam, who sits on London Business School's Executive Education Board and is responsible for curating and representing the school's research. Adam has consulted and taught courses in areas such as unleashing potential and team creativity, strategic innovation, management innovation, organizational culture, high-performing teams, generational paradigms of work and leadership, and fulfilling organizational and personal purpose to organizations including the BBC, BP, Disney, Pixar, Tesco, and Zurich. Okay, so over to you, Adam.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Today we're going to be talking about leadership. And those of us who are here in Britain are witnessing a week of the long knives among our national leaders, our politicians proving that perhaps this referendum has a drama in it. I think they're now struggling to explain what the referendum means in reality, and what we see is party leadership jostling, indicative of no prior agreed contingency planning or indeed leadership plan. Well, at least this example of a very public failure of leadership, I think, appears to help us maybe gain some insight about how we might be better leaders in the business sector. This is, interestingly, this webinar is called The Evolution of Leadership, and in some ways I will argue that leadership has advanced in some significant ways, and in some other ways we're probably still struggling with some of the same issues, questions, and challenges that we faced 30 years ago and even 100 years ago. Our agenda for today is talking about leadership for the 21st century, what the role of learning is in the workplace to facilitate organizational capability in leadership. And then I'm going to go specifically into one important need, and that is that of experiments in terms of how do we learn by doing, and why, as Mary forecast, embracing failure can be a positive development. So let's get right to it. Leadership for the 21st century. What does the future hold? Well, perhaps we first start by looking back. If we go to the 1970s, 1980s, most of the books that I'm familiar with on leadership talk about leadership as an exercise of emulation. So in other words, you saw books like How to Be a Leader Like Jack Welch, How to Be a Leader Like Steve Jobs, How to Be a Leader Like Lee Iacocca, etc. And that is interesting to one respect because you have this living embodiment of leadership, or role models, if you will. On the other hand, I'm sure that it caused a great number of people a huge amount of frustration, consternation, and probably a great sense of inferiority. Because no matter how much we want to be Jack Welch or be Steve Jobs, we can't be those people because we don't have their origins, their background, etc. And so we're experiencing this failure of authentic leadership. And perhaps that's why in the 1990s we saw authentic leadership becoming a very important, strong theme. This idea that, as our professors Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones wrote in their seminal book, Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? They said leadership is about being yourself more with skill. Very interesting, that idea that you bring out the best of yourself, emphasize it, exercise it like a muscle, and then add the skills of business, emotional intelligence, etc., to be, in fact, a better leader than that which you were in the past. Now what we see is leadership as perhaps being a steward of the culture of the organization. And how do you use culture as a lever to enable organizational capability? Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones also just talked about this in their book, Why Should Anyone Work Here?, which, if in the aughts they talked about leadership as authentic individual leadership, Why Should Anyone Work Here is about the authentic organization. So how does one leverage culture? And of course, I think there is good culture and bad culture. Now, interestingly, today, in 2016, London Business School has a Leadership Institute, a research center focused on the study of leadership. And they did an interesting study where they asked alumni, faculty, students, stakeholder groups, corporate partners, what is important to them about leadership, how would they define leadership, and really try to reduce that to the key phrase or element. And what they came up with is this idea that leadership is today about having the courage to be yourself, the authentic leadership theme, the willingness to put yourself at risk when your team needs you, which I think is actually an evolution, because the idea of the leader as an all-seeing, all-powerful, not prone to error individual is, of course, wrong. So having skin in the game and willing to have to take risks and to have allowable weaknesses is an important theme. And the ability to harness your position, power, and insight in order to take your people to a better place. We see this in a number of different areas, such as servant leadership, humble leadership, and I think we're also starting to see it in some of the literature around mentoring. Now, mentoring used to be a very formal agreement where you'd go into the senior person's office and you'd have an hour's conversation, and they would give you some sage advice, and then you'd walk away and hope that you'd be able to do something with that. But as far as that mentor goes, they really had no skin in the game. You could take their advice, not take their advice, but their corporate reputation was not at risk. They weren't putting themselves at risk in order to enhance your abilities. Well, I think maybe a better term for effective mentorship today is sponsorship. So, in other words, it's not about your individual output, but leadership effectiveness is how you coach, how you clear the path, how you enable, how you develop your people, so that their success is the primary KPI of your success. So this idea that leaders are the servants of their people and are their enablers is a critical one today. Put another way, leadership is about unleashing the full potential of your team. So it's about them. It's not about you. Very different from the emulation model of the 1970s and 80s. Why? In order to encourage and enable your people to contribute fully to a better future. But that's me and my reflections on leadership. But I would be very curious to hear your thoughts. So we're going to go very quickly now, as Mary promised, to a poll. So we have a snap survey, and I hope that one of these 5 themes you would identify as a really important competency that the leaders require in your context, in your organization. So what I'd like you to do is vote. And again, you might have an idea about the most important competency that isn't on the screen. That's okay. Just choose what seems the most relevant or the most critical today for you. So do you need your leaders to A, provide meaning, B, increase collaboration, diversity, and inclusion, C, enhance the innovative capability of the organization, D, lead continuous change and agility, or E, build an effective culture? Now, could you please vote now? And while you're doing so, those of you who are joining us from the UK, I'm going to put on a little theme music to get you over the hump here from one of Britain's best-loved game shows. Hope you can hear this. Countdown. Right, so I hope you've all voted now, and the poll, I believe, just closed. I'm keeping an eye on the chat board to see what the results are. 12% said it's about providing meaning. So 20% said increasing collaboration, diversity, and inclusion. I believe it's 4% said enhancing the innovative capability of the organization. 30% lead continuous change and agility, which would mean building an effective culture would be 34%. So this doesn't come as a surprise to me. Perhaps the 34% in terms of building an effective culture is a little bit more than I might have anticipated. But based on the evolution of leadership that I just outlined, it is not terribly surprising. That leading continuous change and agility, that 30%, is I think, also very, very telling. Clearly, we've been talking in business over the last, 8-9 years about VUCA and living in a VUCA world, leading in a VUCA world. VUCA has almost become a cliche. However, I would argue 1 week after Brexit that VUCA is very much alive and well and is a context that is ever more important for leaders to be able to not only demonstrate agility themselves, but to enhance agility as a capability in the organization, perhaps even more importantly, which is part of organizational culture. So D and E are almost two sides of the same coin as far as leading in a post-Brexit world. I would also, though, argue I asked you a slightly unfair question because, of course, it depends on what type of leader we're talking about. Is it our youngest hypo leaders, 20s, 30s, leading others for the first time, still very much within their function and a functional expert? Are we talking about general managers, so leading a wider function, leading a country, leading a department, or senior executives? So if we just take this theme of leading agility or enhancing the culture of agility, the answer would probably be different for these three strata of leader in your organization. So for the youngest leader, it might be their ability to be flexible and to adapt to new possibilities or threats. For the general manager, about refocusing their team on new goals or opportunities or threats, and enhancing the adaptive capability of that group. For the senior executive, horizon scanning, terribly important, identifying the opportunity and threat before it's on top of the organization, courageously exploring new business models. So in other words, questioning who is our customer, what are we offering the customer, how are we offering it, and challenging the status quo, be that of the world, of the customer, of the industry, or of the organization. Nevertheless, in all of these cases, what this is showing is that leadership is contextual, and leadership level is one important context. I would say overall, if there's one theme that I would take in terms of what is the leadership competency we most need today, and what I hear more than any other today among our clients and customers at London Business School Executive Education, is agility. And over this week, I would argue never more so do we need agility as a leadership capability, one which, as I said at the very beginning of today, perhaps our leaders in politics aren't doing a terribly good job of illustrating. To give an idea of why this is more important, as if we need more evidence other than Brexit, Paul Bulcke, the CEO of Nestle, once said that when he started out in business, horizon scanning, being able to identify the right threats and opportunities that we need to spend our organizational time on, was the equivalent of sitting on a swing set and keeping an eye on the horizon. Fairly easy. Yes, you're moving while you're keeping an eye on the horizon, but you always can do so, and the movement isn't terribly fast, and it isn't terribly volatile. Today, that same horizon scanning challenge is trying to do so while you're on a roller coaster. So the horizon sort of comes in and out of view. It seems ever changeable. Where, in fact, even is the horizon? Where is the threat that I need to focus on? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from behind us, etc.? So I suppose in a way this is also just illustrating that VUCA world. But in addition to agility, we also have to remember that leadership is always about relationships. So one is not a leader unless it is in the context of one in relation to other people. I'm sure many of you heard that that guy walking down the street. And leadership is contextual, which was I discussed when we talked about different leadership strata. But also it's about quickly understanding your ever-changing context. So unfortunately, the capabilities that we might need today could very well be different by the end of the year. And so leadership and leadership development is also an exercise in agility. So in other words, rather than setting a 4, 5, 6 year plan of development, think about what are the capabilities we need today, quickly ramping up and implementing those development initiatives, knowing that you're going to be identifying a new competency in a few months or in a year that you will again quickly have to be able to ramp up and implement. And of course, it's about challenging and enabling your team continually to respond, experiment, and get in front. And that's very difficult because many organizations that I see have a different model around innovative or expressing agility, and that is sort of horizon scan and then implement that leadership development required, and then embed, and we'll just stay embedded for a few months or years, and then we'll worry about changing again, 5 years from now. Well, it isn't so much about identify, develop, and embed, but one is almost constantly identifying and embedding new competencies, skills on a dynamic basis, which takes me more importantly to this idea. So what is the role of learning in the workplace to enhance leadership capability? And how do we do that? Well, John Dewey, who's this gentleman, who's also known as the father of modern American education, said that effective learning is about setting up a plan or hypothesis, experimenting with that, actually getting your hands dirty and doing it, reflecting on the result of that doing, adapting based on what you learned, and then experiment again and reflect on the results and adapt and so on and so forth, a never-ending cycle. Ironically, I said John Dewey is called the father of modern American education, but John Dewey wrote this in, I think, 1897 in his treatise of modern education. And it's a lesson that we're still struggling to actually implement and catch up with and do on a regular basis. This learning by doing. So it isn't just about opening up one's head, stuffing information in, and hoping that your people are going to do something different. They have to have the opportunity to handle it and to adapt based on what they're learning. Because one person's model for how to effectively implement a competence is different from another organization's because their context is different. So remember, leadership is relational and contextual. So in the VUCA world, it's what you do with the learning that matters. And of course, many people that we talk to, particularly in the HR function, say, well, ultimately I need to prove the return on my learning, or even say the ROI of my learning. Well, actually, I agree with that. I don't run away from the idea of demonstrating a return on learning, but that is, of course, only possible if people are doing something with it and not simply having an emotional reaction to the learning as our primary indicator of whether that learning engagement was successful or not. I have to be sure that people in the organization trying the same thing, making the same mistake, and again, so better that one person try it, socialize that failure, and then people learn from that, and now you know one way not to do it. So you have to be willing to try. The organization, therefore, has to be able to tolerate failure and has to encourage people to fail fast. In other words, learn, socialize the learning, pick yourself up, you've reflected on your experiment, now. and that is experimentation. So what I'm arguing today is, as far as an action to enhance the leadership competency of agility, requires us to be masters at experimentation. And interestingly, London Business School Executive Education are going through our own internal exploration of this, where we're entering what we're calling the year of experimentation. We're encouraging all of our people to identify a hypothesis and to conduct the experiment throughout the year, and then to share the learning. And whether their hypothesis is proven or disproven, both are equally valid and equally worthy of sharing and celebrating. So what I'd like to spend a little bit of time on is, what does the research tell us about how we set up experiments? Now, for those of you interested in where this is coming from, a lot of it comes from the field of management innovation. So a couple of the London Business School professors who have written a lot about this is Professor Julian Birkinshaw in our Strategy and Entrepreneurship Department, and Professor Gary Hamill, also in our Strategy and Entrepreneurship Department. If you Google them or look on Amazon, you'll see lots of excellent books that they've done. And when they talk about how to set up experiments, they remind us that experiment is not willy-nilly going around and just doing something new or different. One of our professors, strategy professors, Kostas Markides, has famously said, look, I can show up tomorrow and teach a class naked. That would be innovative, but it wouldn't necessarily be helpful. It doesn't add value, and there's really nothing to be learned from that. So the first thing before we just run off and do something new is really think about, well, what is the hypothesis? And ask your people in their experiment to do something that will prove or disprove that hypothesis. Then you can have a wider team, department, or organization scaled up solution based upon the learning or insight from the hypothesis being proven or disproven. So what is a hypothesis? Well, this comes from just good scientific method. Hypothesis is simply a prediction of the outcome of a test. It forms the basis of designing an experiment. It's testable, and it makes a prediction that you can check with observation or testing. So often this is done by comparison, either past to present or post-experiment, or control group to experiment group. But you need to be able to show, because you did something new or different, this was the result. And either the result is something that you predicted, in which case the hypothesis is proven or goes some way to being proven, or the result is not what you expected or predicted, in which case your hypothesis is disproven. Here are just some simple examples about what I'm talking about. Just from everyday life, a simple hypothesis that I might test would be, if we leave the lights on, it will take people longer to fall asleep. You could see how that could be an experiment that you could set up, right? You could you could watch your partner at night and time how long it takes them to fall asleep. Then the next night, or do that for several nights. Then one night, leave the lights on and do the same timing. Do that for a few nights and see if on average the time it takes for them to fall asleep takes longer. I'm not saying your partner is going to like you for it, but that would be a valid experiment. And I will not take any account responsibility for the value of your relationships if you attempt this tonight. Another simple one is, if we refrigerate apples, for example, they will last longer before going bad. So again, clearly we can test this. I can buy a bushel of apples. Hopefully I know they come from the same orchard and were picked at the same time. I put half in the refrigerator. I leave half out. So I have a control group and I have an experiment group. And then I just monitor the apples and I see which one goes bad first. And then again, my hypothesis is proven or disproven. Now, let's go to the world of work. So one example of a valid business hypothesis could be something like, workers who take all their annual leave are more productive than those who don't. This is often something we see, in terms of, so-called face time, or, are our workers more valuable if they work themselves really hard? Well, we can test that. Right? You can take a control group of people who don't take all their annual leave and a control group of those who do, or even specify the number of days. And then look at their KPIs and their annual reviews, for example. Another, which Julian Birkinshaw discussed in an experiment that he conducted with Roche on an executive education program that we've conducted, was something akin to this. Sales staff who have at least one face-to-face meeting per day have a conversion rate at least 25% higher than those who don't. So again, you can easily check this. You can have a portion of sales staff who have no face-to-face meetings, and you can have a group where you mandate that they have at least one face-to-face meeting with a customer, potential customer per day, and then over a period of time, check and see what is the sales rate of those two teams. So that's an example of what we mean when we say the first thing to do to set up an experiment is have a good hypothesis. Second is set your parameters, because you want to give people the freedom to conduct their experiment. You want to give people freedom to define their hypothesis, but clearly you don't want people running around wasting organizational resources, be it time, money, or other. So how much money, for example, is the maximum that any person can spend when they conduct an experiment? How much time would they have maximum to conduct the experiment? What is the goal? And you may have organizational needs. You might want to have, for example, 20 people creating a hypothesis that will help one specific organizational objective, rather than leaving people to determine the goal themselves before they get to definition of hypothesis. And what is the method? Any of these may have resource implications. And as most strategy literature would tell us, you want to give people parameters, but give people freedom within those parameters to experiment. Third way to set up a good experiment, and of course these are all building, so these are not, to take one or the other. It really is take all of these. Give people freedom within those parameters, which I've said. The fourth, the most important objective is the learning. This sounds obvious and intuitive, but I guarantee you that if you were to start conducting experiments in your organization, there would be a substantial portion of your people who, if you don't sufficiently socialize what is good experimentation, they will think if the hypothesis is disproven, they have failed. And that's going to show up in how they're perceived in the organization, or even in their KPIs or annual review or what have you. So it's very important to demonstrate to them that it is the learning, it is the clarity and effectiveness of the experiment, and it is the clarity and helpfulness of the learning that follows. Whether the hypothesis was proven or disproven, that is most important. Therefore, that takes me to point 5. You have to realign attitudes towards so-called failure. Disproving a hypothesis is not failure. In fact, it helps us identify perhaps what not to do. Thomas Edison famously wrote in discussing the invention of the light bulb, "I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." So he famously prototyped about 10,000 light bulbs before he did the one that was successful and went to market. What he also said, which is of course very valid, our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time. A lot of literature on the idea of experimentation in business uses the metaphor of the acorn tree. In other words, an acorn tree is successful because it drops a lot of acorns every autumn. It doesn't know where the best spot of soil is, where is the area that gets the best water, the best sunlight. It just doesn't know. So as a result, it drops hundreds of acorns and knows as a result of that you're going to get one, two, three that will actually grow into trees. Well, the idea is exactly the same in conducting experiments in an organization. You're not going to have 100 successful experiments if you have 100 people conducting them. But in conducting 100 experiments, it is likely that 1, 2, or 3 of them will show you substantial learning that will help you in an exponential way to greater success in the organization. But if you only conduct, say, 1 or 2 experiments, the odds are much lower that that would be the case. So, because this idea of the organization's reaction to failure is so critical to conducting effective experiments, I just want to get a sense of where you think your organization is in relation to responses to failure. And so we have another SNAP survey. So this is just related to the organization in which you work right now, or if you are working, say, for yourself, maybe the previous organization that you worked for. What is the organization's reaction to failure? This is all anonymous, by the way, so none of this is going to get back to you or your boss. Is it A, anyone who fails is quickly fired? Very mercenary organization, that. B, we never speak of failure. It is shameful. Is it C, good failure is tolerated but not really shared? So maybe just a couple people sort of nod, but you certainly wouldn't go wide about that. D, failure is shared to a point, but there is still a bit of a stigma. Or E is failure shared and even celebrated. Do you have failure parties? That would be a good example of an organization that lives the E condition. All right, please vote now, and let's do a little countdown to help us get there. Okay, the poll is now closed. This sounds vaguely like Eurovision, doesn't it? Voting is now closed. And now let's see your results. This is fascinating to me because I think this really goes to the heart of whether the organization is ready, even at a very foundational level, to start being a more agile organization. It really starts here. And it's not unlike literature such as, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, I believe by Patrick Lencioni. So he says that the first thing you need in effective leadership is trust. And that's not very different to this survey that we've just conducted. So what we have here are some results. 2% quickly fired, 19% that failure is shameful, we don't speak of it. 32% say good failure is tolerated. 43% failure is shared to a point, but there's a stigma. And only 3% says that failure is shared and even celebrated. Well, it's not surprising. It is a bit disappointing, but it's certainly not surprising. I don't think any of us have probably worked in more than one organization, if we're lucky, where failure is genuinely shared and celebrated. And of course, if it is, and that learning is quickly socialized, then that can more quickly lead to course correcting the ship or getting an even better result. A good example of that is one of the organizations that I did some work with, Pixar Animation Studios. And this is all public knowledge. It's in Ed Catmull's book. Ed Catmull is their managing director. And he said when they were creating Toy Story 2, they realized as they were developing the film that this wasn't working. Well, they could have just carried on, and sort of run the ship right over the cliff. And at this point, it was really important to their business continuity that this film be a success. They really needed to stop and say, look, it's not working. Exactly what isn't working? And now let's change that, no matter the cost, course correct the ship. And of course, Toy Story 2 ended up being a great success, but it was painful for them. And they had to do a lot of soul searching and, as I say, course correcting. But actually, you know what? I am heartened. You give me heart, because 32% said good failure is tolerated and 43% failure is shared to a point. Well, look, this means 76%, over 3/4 of you, are at least at the midway point of an organization's attitude to failure. This is a good thing. This should give you hope, and all of us hope. I think the result would have been much more skewed toward A and B in the survey 30, 40 years ago. So your job as a leader, and therefore the steward of your organizational culture, is to think about, no matter what answer you put, and if many of you put C or D, how do you get the organization to D or E? Well, conducting experiments in an effective, public, successful way is a great way to start embedding failure in a different paradigm. So let's see if we there we go, advance our slide. So how do we realign attitudes toward failure? Well, so long as there is a stigma around failure, you don't have a learning organization. Because learning is about trying new things. By definition, therefore, people need freedom to fail. And of course, the more ambitious or courageous those new things are, the greater chance people are going to fail before they succeed. And of course, we want those experiments to be some marginal improvements, but we want some of them to be real game changers. Well, that means that a greater percent of those game changer hypotheses are probably going to be disproven, unfortunately. But again, think about the acorn tree. You want to increase the number of those. So really work on this before thinking about, well, what are the learning interventions themselves? How do you unstigmatize learning? And that brings us to the sixth element of how to set up a successful experiment. Socialize the learning from successes and failures, or more accurately, hypotheses, be they proven or disproven. Great story behind this. Everyone probably is aware of Tom Watson, one IBM CEO of a few decades ago. He sort of grew IBM during their golden years. And the story, perhaps the myth, but I think it's a valid story, goes that top salesman wanted to conduct a project but needed resources. Tom Watson gave that salesman $5 million, and the project didn't work. CEO called the salesman into his office. Salesman says, well, surely you're going to fire me now, aren't you? And Watson says, no, fire you? Why would we fire you? We've just spent $5 million training you up. Well, in this case, I would hope Tom Watson to use our framework of a successful experiment. He had parameters, and the parameters were that $5 million was a acceptable cost to learn something, whatever that project was. And obviously, the scope of what is the successful parameter is going to be different for each of you, for your organization, and whether the hypothesis being proven or disproven is going to create marginal improvement, or whether it might help create a moonshot, and that might affect how much resource and you're going to set in terms of your parameters. Which takes us to the seventh area of how to set up an experiment successfully. Build in the means for the organization to adopt and adapt what it learns for the experiment. So once you learn something and you've socialized the learning and everyone is aware of what that learning is, so it's basically saying, now what are we going to do, right? We don't just want to go, huh, that was interesting, and go about our merry way. If there is an action to be done, if there is an ambitious new goal to be pursued, if there's a challenge that has to be defeated, then the organization has to be quickly mobilized to that end. So, just to bring us to a wrap-up, if I would give you 5 key tips or takeaways from these themes of embedding leadership, and specifically embedding what I would argue is the core leadership competency today, agility. Remember that your definition of leadership depends on your context. Almost all of us are dealing with agility as a key priority, if not the top priority. But if you know you have a learning organization, you know that you have an agile organization based on what you observe in the behaviors and activities of your people. It is not just a mindset, it's not just a lesson, it's not just learning. You would see it. And experimentation is a great way for you to be able to see it because you're embedding agility into your leadership culture. So in other words, if you think, well, my organization isn't particularly agile, and I think it would be really tough to see agile activity, well, I would argue start embedding experiments, and at the same time start embedding new attitudes toward failure. And as people start doing experiments, that will start shifting the paradigm of failure, start creating a new paradigm of agility and experimentation in the organization. And simply by doing and having ever more examples of doing experiments, of testing hypotheses, by definition, you will be a more creative and agile and innovative organization. But always remember to share the learning and even celebrate the most spectacular failures that you encounter. In other words, the most disproven hypotheses, because there is learning in that. That would be one of Edison's 10,000 ways not to invent a light bulb, which he had to iterate through in order to get to the one that was. Now, that is a quick view of where I think leadership is going and how you can embed more effective leadership and agile leadership by doing, not just by learning. I hope that was incredibly helpful. I'm looking forward to hearing lots of your questions. And I hope that at least one of you will ask me more about the implications of leadership based on the Brexit campaign, because obviously this is very timely. And I think there's a lot more that we can talk about related to that. But I will pause there and hand things over to Mary, who's curating your questions. And I'm looking forward to hearing your reactions, challenges, and prompts. Thank you very much for your attention so far, and let's have a good conversation.
Thank you so much, Adam, for a really thought-provoking and insightful presentation. Really enjoyed that. I'd like to open the floor up to questions now. So just a reminder to type these into the question box at the right-hand side of your screen, and then click send. I'd actually like to kick off, Adam, with a question from me. We've seen a lot of examples recently of collective leadership failure, looking at government, football, British Home Stores, Sports Direct. You said we now need to understand how to fail fast. So in this context, what do you think are the leadership capabilities required to take this country forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's talk about this in relation to some of the spectacular leadership failures that we observed in the EU referendum. And I think what's useful about this, and which is related to my discussion of agility, is that the EU question is a very complex one, right? Now, I'm sure that comes as a surprise to no one. But my challenge to the process, though, is that the referendum asked instead a very simple question: should the UK leave the EU? Now, that is actually, behind that is a complexity that is so great that to reduce it to a question like that demonstrated a disconnect between were people answering the question, or were they interpreting the question in 33 million different ways. I think there's about 33 million people who voted. I mentioned one of our professors, Julian Birkinshaw. He recently wrote, just a day ago, I think, in Forbes about this. And he said, in the referendum, the question, should the UK leave the EU, was so fiendishly difficult, many people answered an easier question. Essentially, are you happy with the state of the world right now? Well, is it not obvious that countries or companies should not be making irreversible decisions on this basis? And so that's why I think this illustrates my point that we have to test our hypotheses before we take, in the case of the EU referendum, a great leap in the dark, asking people to basically pose to themselves a number of different hypotheses and interpret the questions in a lot of different ways. So no wonder now that our politicians are encountering huge degrees of confusion about what exactly the public has asked of them to do. I think, I'm sure most of you are aware, this is today's news, that Boris Johnson declared that he's not going to be running for leader of the party. I wonder if deep down in his soul he's asking, my God, what have I begun? And am I confident that I can get us to the promised land? I guess my point is this: deep expertise and sophisticated analysis gets you so far. But that might mean getting into the different aspects of a fiendishly difficult question through different lenses, asking different questions, numerous questions, testing numerous different hypotheses. The other important point, I think, for leadership in this case is that I think the referendum was largely won by the Leave campaign on emotion and on hope. So, very strongly appealing to freedom and patriotism and hope and independence and vote for democracy. And the Remain campaign was trying to give a very logical, sort of fact-driven campaign, very much driven by the head, and the Leave campaign very much driven by the heart. Well, again, when trying to probably incorrectly reduce a very complex question to a very simple one, it doesn't surprise me that the Leave campaign would use emotion to maybe get people over the hump in terms of coming to terms with voting in a way that they would wish. And that also leads us to this question of governance, right? In companies, how do we make decisions? Well, complex decisions require some complex soul-searching, fact-searching, exploration, and hypothesis. So let's not, I suppose, try to find the easy answer to complex questions. Let's, explore the different aspects of that question, but do so quickly. But don't, rely on jingoism, emotion, and taking a complex question and trying to make it really, really simple. In that case, the basis upon which a board, an executive committee is making a decision might be the wrong foundation.
Okay. Adam, Casey's asked the question, do you think there are any MPs at the moment that really stand out for leadership?
Oh, MPs that stand out for leadership. Oh my goodness. You're really putting me on the spot now. Disappointingly, no one stands out as sort of a shining example for me. I think, yes, this is the person. Really not. I would say, if anything, looking, for example, at the Conservative Party, I think there is a reason Theresa May is sort of is the favorite now, I think, to win the leadership, and that is that she seems to be more of a voice of reason. And look, I'm saying my reflection of the press. I'm actually not giving I'm not trying to promote an opinion here, because I know politics, particularly right now, is an incredibly divisive one. I'm just thinking about, and I'm trying to collate what I've read recently about the different leadership races. And what's interesting is that people are saying in relation to Theresa May that she seems to be embracing the complexity. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. That's my caveat. But what's also interesting is that the press is picking up on that, and perhaps even tacitly or explicitly guiding readers to say, isn't this what we need right now? That's my hypothesis, but I haven't attempted to prove it yet.
Just apologies, there seems to be a small echo on the line when I come onto the wave, so apologies to the listeners for that. I'll try and keep my contribution to a minimum here. Adam, we've had a question through from Yvonne, which is kind of following on from that, which is around how do you maintain resilience in a time of roller coaster leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so a couple of points on this. It's a wonderful question. It's absolutely the right question to ask right now. A couple of things. First, have a shared vision. In other words, it's really helpful if your people understand the ultimate goal of where you're heading, while recognizing that the path that you're going to have to take to get there might change as your context changes, be it regulation, be it competition, be it new market entry. Second is always over-communicate. So in other words, never assume that all your people have that shared vision. Better to tell them more often than not. Better tell them one more time than they need it. In fact, recent research finds that 68% of employees don't understand their company vision. Well, how can people work together toward a shared goal if they don't even know what that goal is? And now, on this point of over-communication, most senior executives, I think, are terrible communicators. But ironically, I think they think they're great communicators. And this leads to asking for feedback. So if leaders ask for feedback, not only does that help inevitably demonstrate that they are better in terms of communication as a listening act, not just a speaking act, but also perhaps indicates that they care about what their people are thinking. And in particularly volatile times, and times which require resilience, as you correctly pointed out in your question, leaders even more so need to demonstrate empathy. So put yourself in your people's shoes. You probably have heard the cliche, though I think it's true, that empathy is sometimes called the deepest form of respect. It shows you care about your people. And that will help you to take people with you, particularly if you have to take some of them somewhere that they don't initially want to go. I would say the other point in terms of building resilience is Don't be afraid to start small. In other words, if you need to take some people where they don't want to go, build from common ground. Figure out where does people pretty much universally agree. Start from there, get traction, take a step forward, celebrate that step forward. Then maybe you can take 2 steps forward, celebrate that progress. So employees may want to see the benefits, of one part of a big change before venturing further down that path. So if you want the organization to embrace change and volatility with resilience, point out and embrace the quick wins. Don't minimize them or say, well, that's wholly insufficient. And finally, of course, I think leaders have to be the role model of the behaviors they want from others. So if you want your people to be resilient, then you have to 24/7 demonstrate in your emotions, in how you communicate and how you listen, that you are being resilient yourself. People have a sixth sense for integrity. They'll know if you're making it up or just saying it. And again, with practice makes perfect. So even if you don't always feel 100% confident, if you're always practicing resilience, it gets easier. And people pick up on that, and then they start to hopefully emulate that. And then you enable them.
Okay, actually, just picking up on that point, somebody's asked, do you think that lying is ever justified as a leader? In the EU referendum, both sides lied to some extent. Is lying ever acceptable?
My view is no, because I think people will find you out. And if you're found out, and all of a sudden now people would question the veracity and integrity of anything you tell them, you're nowhere. This goes back to the work I mentioned by Lencioni, the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Basically, his point is you must have trust first and foremost. If you don't have trust, then people are never going to engage in dialogue and debate about direction or change of direction. If people aren't always engaged in debate and dialogue, then they're never going to be committed to the direction or new direction you're going. And if they're never committed, you're never going to have accountability from the individuals and collectively from your team. And if you don't have accountability, you're never going to see results, positive results. So always go back to trust. And of course, lying to someone is the shortest way to erode trust. And I think the research shows that you would never have a genuinely effective team if either the leader of the team is lying and is found out, or even people within the team are lying to one another. I know sometimes the temptation is to lie to comfort people, but I think ultimately that is maybe a short-term gain for a long-term huge step back.
Okay, we're fast running out of time, unfortunately, Adam. We've got quite a lot of questions still coming in, so I'm going to ask a final one. During the presentation and the poll that you did, hardly any organisation said that failure is actually celebrated. So, do you think that there's a fundamental shift that has to happen in attitudes towards failure at a young age? So, maybe how success and failure are taught at schools?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So caveat is I don't have children, but I know many people, friends and family, who do. And it's interesting. Many of them have told me, and I'd be curious if if everyone listening is nodding along, that failure as a concept has perhaps been a muted idea. So in other words, the idea of always positive reinforcement, does that mean that people actually identify the difference between success and failure? I think you have to acknowledge failure, but also help children to build in that resilience. In other words, to say, okay, that was a failure. What did you learn from that? Going back to my original point. So what might you do next time? But if instead someone fails and at the school's reaction is, oh, that was a fantastic job, that was wonderful, and then leave it at that, then there is no learning. from the failure, and that child is just as likely to make exactly the same mistake next time round. So perhaps then it comes as a shock to them when they join an organization that calls failure and says that was not the right way to do it. One might find that to be a shock to their system. Now, I don't know if that's true, in many schools or more schools than in the past. What some of my friends and family are telling me is that that might be the case. I think you sort of see it in grade inflation. Now, I'm not as I've lived in this country, in the UK, for 17 years. I'm a citizen here, but as you can probably tell from my accent, I was raised in the US, and even then, as I was growing up, I was aware of this idea of grade inflation in schools and in universities, even in higher education. So in other words, the quality of work that one did for a course, might have earned them a C grade 50 years ago, and today it earns them an A minus. Well, I think that inevitably, affects people's attitudes, that sort of sense of entitlement to success, which then mutes or retards one's ability to both identify failure, to accept it with an open mind, and to say, what's the learning so that I can continuously improve? But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. I think, regardless of anything else, I think, the changes that are happening at the moment have really provided, I guess, an opportunity for us all to develop our responsibility in how we react to change in this very, very fast-changing world. So thank you very much for taking those questions. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for today, so all that remains is for me to say thank you very much to everybody for attending the webinar today, and thank you very much to Adam and to London Business School for hosting. We've recorded the webinar, so we will be sending out the full recording very soon, in the next few days, and thank you very much indeed for your time. And we hope to see you on another Change Board webinar very soon. Thank you.